I would like to begin by just saying that there was a little bit of a misunderstanding, so I just want to make sure we're clear. Tonight, I'm going to be doing the last Parsha class on Parashat Vayikra, and next week I'm going to be doing a class which is in preparation of Pesach called The Courage to be Free. So this week we're doing the Parsha, and this will be in effect really the last Parsha class for the foreseeable future. So I would like to begin by picking up where we ended last week. Last week we spoke about the end of the book of Shemot, and as we mentioned, the end of the book of Shemot is really the crowning point where the Jewish people construct the tabernacle and in effect are bringing back the presence of God into the world. So that the very last chapters all deal with the process of the construction of the building, of the structure. Parashat Vayikra, not only Parashat Vayikra, but one could say the whole book of Vayikra, is introducing a different aspect of the temple, which is the temple service. So that there's the building and then there's the actual service which is being done in the temple. In rabbinic literature, the book of Vayikra is generally known as Torat Kohanim, the Torah of the priests. And kind of ironically, in academic circles, it's also seen as the book of holiness, or you could say the priestly code. And generally, when we think about Vayikra being the book of the priests, so we think about sacrifices, laws of ritual purity and impurity, all kinds of laws which are in fact related to the priests. And there's absolutely no question that this is what we find in the book of Vayikra. But I would like to offer another understanding of what it means to call Vayikra Torat Kohanim. And that's based on a verse which I think people are familiar with, a verse that appears at Mount Sinai. This is in the book of Shemot, in chapter 19. Let me just find it. I think it's verse 6 or 7. In chapter, as I said, chapter 19, verse 6, God says to Moshe says to the Jewish people, before the revelation at Sinai, when they first come to the mountain, Va'atem tihiyu li, and you will be to me, mamlechet kohanim vegoy kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy people. So that in fact, the book of Vayikra is the Torah of the priests, but not just of the priests who are serving in the tabernacle, but of the Jewish people who are referred to as a mamlechet kohanim. And in fact, if we look at the book as a whole, the book actually is focusing on creating what we could call an ideal Jewish society. And it begins with the focus of the tabernacle, with all the rules and regulations of the tabernacle, which is at the core of our society. But it then expands out to what is going on in the general Jewish population. And now I'm going to just try something, right? Just hopefully I'm not technologically challenged. I prepared a source sheet, and I think that it's been posted. So I will share the source sheet for 1 second on the screen. Okay, let's find it. Okay, that was pretty easy. So I do have a whole bunch of references in Hebrew at the bottom, but what I did over here was to show you an outline of the book of Vayikra, so that it's also a good opportunity for me to perhaps just get in certain things which I won't be discussing, okay, after this week. If you look at the book of Vayikra, it's very interesting. So the first 10 chapters really have to do with sacrifices, with the temple service. And I actually broke it down into each chapter, which I'll come back to a little bit later in the shir in terms of our parsha. When you look at chapter 11, all of a sudden we're not talking about the temple, but in fact, what we're talking about are laws of kashrut. Which animals are we permitted to eat? Which are prohibited animals, fish, birds? Then in chapter 12 to 15, we come back to what might be seen as temple-related material, which has to do with laws of ritual impurity and purity. And we talk specifically about impurity, which is created as a result of something of a person's body, somehow associated with one's body. We then go on to chapter 16, where we have the Yom Kippur temple service. So again, if you look at it up to, and maybe we'll just do chapter 17, is the prohibition of sacrificing outside the temple. So in fact, in the first 17 chapters, pretty much 16 out of 17 are really temple related, with chapter 11 that's talking about the laws of kashrut, okay, which has to do with, in general, what's happening. In fact, I would say that we're not going to do this now, but if you actually look into the laws of kashrut, you'll see how they are actually an extension of the temple service. But then we get to chapter 18, which discusses prohibited sexual relations. And then we get to chapter 19, which has a whole series of interpersonal relation laws. Chapter 20, which again deals with prohibited sexual relations, but focuses on the punishment. And then we have 21 and 22, which come back to the priests and have to do with who the priests can marry, prohibitions of becoming impure, blemishes that can disqualify a priest from functioning in the temple. But then we have 23, which speaks about the festivals, which is relevant to the general Jewish population. 24 has to do with the temple, once again, the lighting of the menorah, the showbread. I'll leave the blasphemer out of the picture for the moment. And then we get to the final thing, which is the laws of the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year. Within that framework, various laws related to tzedakah, giving charity. And the culmination, even though it's chapter 26 and there's still one more chapter afterwards, is a section called the blessings and the curses, where God, in fact, it's essentially the conclusion of the covenant at Sinai, which we discussed once in chapter 24 of Shmot, when the Jewish people entered into a covenantal relationship with God, brought sacrifices, where they said Na'aseh v'nishma, and that covenant, in a certain sense, is brought to its conclusion in chapter 26 in Vayikra with the blessings and curses. And for all intents and purposes, that concludes the chapter which is known as Mount Sinai. Because in the next book, in the book of Bamidbar, the Jewish people begin to prepare themselves to come into the land of Israel. We're not going to get into Bamidbar now, but what do I want you to see from this? On the one hand, it's true that most of the book of Vayikra deals with subjects, topics related to the temple, sacrifices, laws of ritual purity and impurity, all kinds of laws related to the priests. But we certainly have other laws, such as kashrut, such as prohibited sexual relations, interpersonal relations, festivals, sabbatical year, Jubilee year, tzedakah, which go far beyond the temple, which in effect have to do with the Jewish people as a whole. So therefore, the first thing which I would like to really, I hope I've illustrated this, is to in fact show you that the book of Vayikra is not only dealing with the temple, the tabernacle. The book of Vayikra essentially is dealing with what are the regulations of a Jewish society. What are the regulations that will, and if I pick up on things we've been discussing the past few weeks, if at the end of the book of Shemot, just wait 1 second, it says my internet connection is unstable. Of the book of Shemot, we see how the glory of God fills the tabernacle. At the end of the book of Vayikra, the idea is that, I might say, the glory of God is going to fill the land of Israel, not just the tabernacle, where somehow God's presence will be visible in everything that's happening in the land of Israel. And that point is clearly demonstrated in the section of the blessings. Now, the reason why I'm making such a point of this is because I know that for many, many people, the book of Vayikra is very, very boring. It's very technical. It's something which people don't study, right? At Pardes, I actually, I taught Chumash. I must have taught Chumash. It must have been for 35 years, maybe a little bit more than that. And I would say that probably 33 out of 35, I taught the book of Shemot and I taught the book of Breshit. In fact, I have actually a very interesting story. Many, many years ago, I mentioned the other week, Nechama Leibowitz. I don't know what the reason was, but somehow she came to Pardes one time to give a class for the teachers. And I knew her, and partially through my mother-in-law, partially through other channels. And at the end of the year, we started speaking, and I don't even know how it came up. But I said to her that, by the way, I'm teaching the book of Vayikra. So she said, oh, of course, you're teaching Parashat Kedoshim, which is chapter 19 that has to do with interpersonal laws. So I said, no, I'm teaching from the beginning of the book with all the sacrifices. And then she kind of raised her eyebrows. Be'emet? Really? It's like, who would be teaching about sacrifices? It so happened that year I actually had, it was an interesting, mixture of people in the class, someone who went on to be a Reform rabbi, conservative rabbi, Reconstructionist rabbi, and they all got into sacrifices, which was really very interesting. So, but in any case, the point which I want to make is that generally, most people find it very hard to get into Vayikra. Much easier, Breshit, Shemot, all these stories that are exciting and have all kinds of messages. And what about Vayikra? So what I would like to begin with, and I'll just recommend this for anybody who wants to do further study, and in particular, if you want to study about sacrifices, about laws of purity. Okay, so first of all, an excellent commentary that really makes this very meaningful, I'll tell you right now, is the commentary of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who I've mentioned on a number of occasions. Okay, and we'll come back to him later. So I would recommend that. But probably the most comprehensive commentary was written by a conservative rabbi, university professor, whose name was Jacob Milgram. He was a professor in the University of Berkeley, and then he was also in the Hebrew University. And he wrote what I call a magnum opus on the book of Vayikra. And it's interesting that he actually describes what was it that motivated him to do this. So he said that he was motivated because at one point he was teaching in a Catholic university, and he was teaching, when he started out his teaching career, he was teaching Isaiah, he was teaching certain other prophets. And then one year he suggested the possibility of teaching the book of Vayikra. And then all of a sudden he was stonewalled. It's like, what are you kidding? Vayikra? We don't do this. Okay. And it's like, that's the Old Testament, but not just the Old Testament. It's the Old Testament that's completely irrelevant. Why would anybody want to teach about that? And so I think that prompted him to then, and then when he started like looking into it, he saw that there was really very little, what might be called academic literature on the book of Vayikra, and whatever existed was usually very polemical and very, very negative and possibly even anti-Semitic. Okay, as a way of showing, how the ancient Jews were very primitive, et cetera, et cetera. So he made it his baby to now research Vayikra, and what he actually got into was this idea of, and he says this, if you're interested, he has his like more academic work, and then he has what I call his Reader's Digest, which is put out by Continental Press. You can Google it, you'll find it. And in it, he says that the book of Vayikra is all about values. And it's all a question of being able to read it the right way and to then see what are the values that are being exhibited. And so that's what I would like to actually spend the rest of our time looking at. Okay, the values of the book of Vayikra. Or in particular, I would like to look at our Parsha that deals with sacrifices, and to see to what extent is it that there actually are values that we can pick up from here. Now, before I actually get into that part, and if anybody has my source sheet, so you'll see it, there's I have my sources, I apologize, are in Hebrew, but I will be translating, paraphrasing, and for those of you who want to look at the actual Hebrew, you can look afterwards. I want to begin with Nachmanides. Nachmanides has a comment. Okay, this is in chapter 1 on verse 9, where he starts going into a whole discussion about sacrifices. And he begins his discussion by quoting Maimonides, Rambam. And all of you, I imagine, are familiar with the Guide to the Perplexed. And in the Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides goes into this whole thing, which again, I'm paraphrasing, which is saying that sacrifices was essentially a concession to the Jewish people, a concession to the Jewish people who grew up in a pagan environment. And as a result of that, you had to somehow speak the language that they were accustomed to in terms of how you worship God. And the implication, which many people have drawn from Maimonides, and he's become a pillar, okay, I guess for more progressive movements, is to say that, well, of course, the ideal way that we should serve God is on a more abstract level, which means what is really the ideal service of God? The ideal service of God is prayer. The ideal service of God is studying Torah. But sacrifices, it's bloody. It's very dirty. It's something which also goes against our grain, okay, our human sensitivities. So that's something which ideally we shouldn't be doing. We're killing animals. And that would be the conclusion one would draw from Maimonides. Nachmanides, and you could say it would also seem very consistent with Maimonides, because Maimonides is a rationalist, okay? And presumably he's somebody who's very much into the intellect, and he speaks a lot about this in terms of how one actually comes to a knowledge of God and a service of God through that. Nachmanides, who's a Kabbalist, okay, was not actually so happy with that approach. And he actually attacks Maimonides. He uses very, very harsh language. If you actually have, what I brought you, okay, he really says that what Maimonides says, right? The Hebrew word for it is shtuyot. This is nonsense. It's ridiculous, okay? And he then goes into a whole tirade about how this is just couldn't be. And in effect, what Nachmanides says is that what Maimonides is doing is making the table of God, right, which is the altar, something which is revolting. Because he's in effect saying that what we're doing is really, from our perspective, something which is really revolting. But what can we do? That's, we made a concession to people who are accustomed to pagan practices. Now, I just want to point out that Nachmanides, though, has a few sources, so to speak, source texts, which kind of support him. Because what Nachmanides says is, well, let's look at where did sacrifices originate? So I would imagine, okay, I'm sorry that we can't make this more interactive, okay? So I'll just do this as a kind of, rhetorical comment. So he says the first time in the Torah where we find the sacrifice, right? I'm sure everybody knows. I see Nancy shaking her head, okay, is chapter 4 of Breshit, Cain and Abel, where we find that Cain brings an offering to God, which is called a mincha, which actually appears in our parsha. And then we find, and his offering is essentially produce from the earth. And then we find that Abel, in response, brings animals as an offering to God. And not only that, but God is very receptive to the offering of Abel. Now, Nachmanides immediately says, well, wait a second. At this point in time, there is no idolatry. And yet what you find is that here is an offering which is being brought to God, in particular, an animal offering, and that is seen as being very favorable to God. And then he goes on to say, later on we find by Noach in chapter 9 in Breshit, when Noach comes off the boat, so he brings sacrifices to God, burnt offerings. And God smells the offerings, and on that basis makes a unilateral covenant that he will never destroy the world again. And then you have the third instance, which we're all familiar with, which is the binding of Isaac. And there God explicitly says to Abraham to offer up his son. Instead, Abraham offers up the ram, and that actually seems to be what sets the precedent for the temple later on the Temple Mount and the whole sacrificial service. So what Nachmanides says is, so look, we have Cain and Abel, we have Noah, we have Abraham. All of these things are happening before the Jewish people go down to Egypt, before they're exposed to what you might call a pagan culture. And yet, nevertheless, people are offering sacrifices, and that is seen as actually being very, very positive. So this is Nachmanides' position. And then the question is, so how do we deal with that? And I want to be on the, up front and say that it's not as if, like I find it given even though I love meat and I love barbecues, but I still would find it a little bit hard, right? Even, on many levels to imagine, what it would be like to actually have a temple service slaughtering animals. But nevertheless, if we do have it, the question is, how do we relate to it? And so what I would like to mention is a comment by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who actually I have on my sheet and who I told you I strongly recommend your reading. And essentially what he does is to examine all the sacrifices, and he does this with the tabernacle also, and he does this with the laws of ritual purity and impurity, to examine these things on a symbolic level and to try to understand what is the deeper meaning behind what's going on. And on that basis, and he begins with something which I think becomes a very important statement, which is, what is the word sacrifice itself? What does it mean? And what's implicit in that word? And it's very interesting that he actually, and I have it on my sheet, so the Hebrew translation speaks about, he doesn't use the word sacrifice even. He uses the word offering. And he actually is not happy with translating, right, sacrifices or the Hebrew word korban as an offering. And what he does is to say, well, just look at the Hebrew. The word korban, the root of that word, is kuf resh bet, karov, which means to be near. And on that basis, what he says is that the purpose of a sacrifice is to bring people into a close relationship with God. That is the goal of the sacrifice. Now, you might say, well, that's actually, maybe that's obvious, right? In other words, that's what you want to do. But it's not necessarily so obvious. I think I might have mentioned this in a podcast, but if I didn't, so I think it's worth noting right now. When Moshe goes to Pharaoh and he's negotiating that Pharaoh should let the Jewish people go out for 3 days in the desert in order to sacrifice to their God, and you can look this up. This is Shmot, chapter 5, verse 3. Moshe and Aaron say to Pharaoh, the God of the Hebrews appeared to us, and let us go out for 3 days in the desert. Let us sacrifice to our God. And then he says, pen yifka enu, lest he will harm us, badever ovecharev, with a plague or with a sword. Now, that point becomes extremely important because when Moshe says that, he is now appealing to what was at that time a pagan concept of sacrificing. And by the way, Jacob Milgram in his book really highlights this. He says that the pagan understanding, why do you sacrifice? The reason you're sacrificing is not because you want to have a relationship with God. The reason why you have it is because you see God as being a hostile force that in effect you want to be able to then ward off. And it's as if, and by the way, even the language that he uses, that God appeared. Well, actually, if you take the word nikra elenu, it's like God happened to be. Okay, and what's the idea? Here is this God who just popped in. And we might even say it's a God who's very whimsical. And that's the way the gods are. It's like, if you read, classic Greek literature or other, stories, myths, you see that very often the gods kind of get bored. So when they get bored, so then they have to start making trouble, rustling up, things in the human sphere, okay? Because otherwise, what are they going to do? So, and in a certain sense, it fits in with this way of looking at the world that the gods come in and essentially, right, in other words, they're kind of playing around with people. They're really hostile to people. And what we do is we try to, in a certain sense, buy them off, get them off our backs. So that's why we offer these sacrifices, so that the whole purpose of the sacrifice is essentially to appease and to somehow, I would say, to to estrange some hostile force so that they don't harm me. And what Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch is saying, and quite a few other commentaries, that the Jewish concept of sacrifices is a total opposite. But before I speak about the total opposite, it's also based on a totally different understanding of God. Rather than seeing the gods as being hostile forces in the world, as being elements that are preoccupied with their power, with their self-aggrandizement, our image of God is a God of loving kindness, of a God of compassion, of a God who actually is looking to promote our well-being. And so therefore, the whole purpose of the sacrifice is to now connect with that God, to be able to come close to that God, to realize that my well-being is very much inextricably connected with that God, not because that God wants to harm me, but because that God wants to actually empower me. So that, and this is why the name of God, which appears throughout in the sacrifices, is the four-letter name of God. The four-letter name of God, Hashem, which on the one hand has to do with the idea of a supernatural God, which we discussed back in Shmot by the plagues, but it also has to do with the idea of a God of compassion, of a God who's very much interested in the well-being of us as human beings. So this is the first starting point, which I like to begin with. Why bring sacrifices? Because the sacrifices are actually a way of coming close to God. But then I want to take it another step. It's not only that I'm coming close to God, but somehow by bringing the sacrifices, they actually elevate me. They enable me to maximize my human potential. And now I would like to look as an example. Okay, maybe we'll now, if you have the sheet, fine. If you don't, so I'll just mention it now. It's very interesting to see that in our Parashat, we have 5 types of sacrifices that are described. And it actually, the division is very nice. According to the chapter division, in chapter 1, the first sacrifice which we discuss is what's called the Korban Ola. A Korban Ola literally means an offering that goes up. And what characterizes a Korban Ola is that it is totally burnt on the altar, totally offered to God. And then in chapter 1, we have 3 different types. We have, of Ola, we have one that can be brought from cattle, it can be brought from sheep, it can be brought from goats, from birds. We can also have a Korban Ola. Chapter 2. Chapter 2, we talk about meal offerings, flour and oil. And there we have, again, different types of meal offerings. And it's all a function of, how you prepare it. You can have something which is deep fried, something which is just fried, something which is cooked in an oven, something which is just flour and oil that's mixed together. So there are a whole variety of offerings. The common denominator is that we're talking essentially about fine flour mixed with oil. Okay, but then the question is, do we do anything else in the offering? That's chapter 2. Then we get to chapter 3. Chapter 3, we have what's called peace offerings, Korban Shlamim. And for those of you who know, Shlamim related to the word Shalom. And as I usually like to quip What makes them peace offerings is because everybody gets a piece. God gets a piece because you put part of the offering on the altar. The priest gets a piece. And the bulk of the offering is actually meant to be eaten by the person who brings it. So that's, and then again, we have, it can be brought from cattle, it can be brought from sheep, it can be brought from goats, not from birds. Chapter 4, we talk about a whole variety of sin offerings. And the different types of sin offerings is a function of who sinned. Is it the high priest? Is it the king? Is it a regular person? Is it the Jewish community as a whole? And then in chapter 5, we have certain other types of sin offerings. And then we have what are called guilt offerings. Guilt offerings that could be brought because of sacrilege, because of misuse of temple property. And at the very end, a guilt offering that's brought in a situation where somebody steals and compounds the crime when they're caught by taking a false oath in the name of God, and then subsequently admits that they stole and took a false oath, then they have to bring a guilt offering for stealing. Okay, I hope that I've been somewhat clear. Now, if you have my sheet in front of you, and that's fine, and if you don't, you'll take my word on it. It's very interesting that the initial offerings that we speak about are voluntary offerings. It's only at the end, when we get to the sin offering and the guilt offering, that we speak about obligatory offerings. Namely, in certain situations where one sins, they have to bring a sin offering. By the way, the general situation, right, the classic example for a sin offering is where you've committed a crime where the penalty is karet, if you do it intentionally. If you do it unintentionally, you bring a sin offering. What's an example of that? Well, an example of that could be desecration of Shabbat, or it could be eating on Yom Kippur, or eating chametz on Pesach, or it could be violating the prohibited sexual relationships described in chapter 18 of Leviticus. So in all those situations, if you did the sin unintentionally, you're obligated to bring a sin offering. Sin offerings are not brought for intentional sins, only for unintentional, where you didn't realize that this was something that was wrong. Guilt offerings are different. Chapter 5, the offerings that are mentioned in chapter 5 are offerings that are brought even when the person did it intentionally, consciously. Okay, so what do I want to say with that? So what I want to begin with is that if in fact the purpose of sacrifices is to bring people into relationship with God, to bring people close to God, ideally the sacrifices are not dictated, which means they're not obligated. The whole idea is that a person should be bringing a sacrifice voluntarily. It should be something which they're bringing because they want to now come into a close relationship with God. And that's actually the ideal. Essentially, if I go by this understanding, the essential offerings were the ones that are done voluntarily. Yes, we have the sin offerings, and there's a need to have the sin offerings. But ideally, the purpose of the offerings should be to bring one into a relationship with God, which a person engages voluntarily. Now, if I look into this a little bit more, so it's interesting also the order that we have. So let's start with the burnt offering. And perhaps we could take the story of the binding of Isaac as a kind of model for what is the meaning behind a burnt offering. Well, in the story of the Akedah, essentially what God is telling Abraham, I want you to demonstrate that you are completely committed to God, that you are prepared to do everything for God. And if that's the case, so a person who brings a burnt offering, in effect, when that offering is totally consumed on the altar, is in effect saying, I am now prepared to dedicate myself completely to God. In effect, this is what we say in the Shema when we say that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. It's a declaration, a statement. Except that in the Shema, we say it verbally, and in the sacrifices, we do something. And now I want to come to actually what I mentioned earlier about, how can someone perhaps relate to the sacrifices, which are really very disturbing, let's say. So I want to actually say that the sacrifices are not necessarily what I would call an aesthetic experience, okay, which is actually something that's, warm and fuzzy and it makes me feel good. And it's actually something that can be a very devastating experience. And to a certain extent, this idea of taking an animal, for example, slaughtering it, and especially in the context of the Tanakh, where there was an assumption that people might be bringing the animals which they had actually grown and raised, and as a result, maybe even have a relationship with. And the idea to now bring it and offer it to God, the idea of perhaps, depending on the type of animal, of maybe, and the life force that it has within it, the identification between the person and the animal, that when that animal is actually being slaughtered, okay, to a certain extent, right, it has a life force to it. The association someone makes between the animal and themselves. And the question is, when you do that act or you see that act being done, what's the impact, the visceral impact it has on you in terms of, the message, and to what extent? So I was saying before, this idea of, a Korban Ola is this idea of a total commitment to God. And I think I mentioned this at one point when we were speaking about the Akedah, I think, that it's the idea that I have a total commitment to God, even when things are painful, even when things don't go exactly the way that I think they should be going. And the question is, to what extent does somebody actually, when you talk about a total commitment, we talk about through thick and thin, through fire and water, how much is somebody really prepared to make that absolute commitment? And to realize that maybe that also means that sometimes it'll be painful. Are you prepared to do that? And again, if the person is bringing this voluntarily, then this is a statement which they want to make. I'll skip the Korban Mincha for a moment and talk about the Korban Shlamim. And especially because of how it relates now to this season, because Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, is a subset of the Korban Shlamim. I mentioned to you that Korban Shlamim, everybody gets a piece. But essentially, it's for the purpose of being eaten. But if we're talking about an animal, and I mentioned also, birds are not brought as a Korban Shlamim. Why? because there's just so much that you can eat in a bird. By an animal, right? There's a lot to eat. Now, why is that important? Because if there's a lot to eat, it means that the person is not going to eat it by themselves. In order to eat it, they have to have other people with them. And the whole thrust of a Korban Shlamim is not only to have a relationship with God, but essentially to have that relationship with God being reflected in having a community that comes together. So that the Korban Shlamim is a way of building community around service of God. So if, in a certain sense, by the Korban Ola, it's vertical, by the Korban Shlamim, it's much more horizontal. And this is the way of somehow bringing us together as a community. And this is certainly the case by the Korban Pesach, which I'll speak about much more next week. Korban Mincha, the meal offering. The whole thrust of a meal offering mincha, many commentaries say, is a present which I'm giving to God. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch says it's an expression of homage. It's a recognition that whatever I own ultimately belongs to someone else, to some higher entity. This is why when Cain brings the first offering, which is a mincha, he brings it from the produce. By bringing it from the produce, he's saying whatever grew right now is not necessarily what I produced. Yes, I worked, etc., but ultimately it's the blessing of God. And as a way of acknowledging that whatever I have is really a gift from God. So then this is the mincha which I bring, to say to God, I'm giving you really what's yours. Now, I want to digress for one moment, although it's not a digression because it's really maybe even central to what I was speaking about before. Well, if you look about, what we're describing over here, so now think about translating this outside the temple. And what do I mean by that? So take the Korban Ola, which is expressing, right, this idea of a total commitment in a relationship. Well, how does that then play itself out in relationship with people? To what extent is it that we really try to maximize the relationship we have with people, the sense of commitment we have? It could be in terms of family relationships between parents and children, between spouses. It could be in the workforce. It could be in our communities. Is there really a commitment, and are we committed even when things get tough? Or is it, which seems very often to be the tendency today, well, if things aren't working out, so I just pick up and go and shift. And so that the whole idea of relationships then loses its meaning. And maybe even the idea of how do we do things to be able to come close to people, to create that, to realize that, in other words, we have to be invested, okay, in order to be able to develop those relationships. Take the Korban Mincha. Well, if I really acknowledge that whatever I have is really God's, well, maybe that plays itself out in tzedakah. Why give charity? Well, because it's really not your money. It's really something that was given to you as a gift from God. If it's a gift from God, it's more of like a kind of deposit. So then maybe you should now share that with other people. So I'm just trying to give you a few examples of how, in fact, from what's happening in the sacrifices, we could make a translation into our reality. How about a Korban Chatat, a sin offering? Nachmanides, by the way, focuses on the Korban Chatat. And Nachmanides actually says, well, again, if you take the example of the sin offerings, which I had mentioned to you, it's not for any sin, but it's a sin which is seen as being a kind of capital crime, a major sin. And it's a major sin which wasn't done intentionally, unintentionally. But in the case of a sin offering, so first of all, to what extent does a person acknowledge that doing that type of sin is actually serious? Very serious, to the point where it could totally break the relationship. Now, again, if we were talking in another context, just to illustrate this, right? And some of you may get this from TV programs, others from reading books, and some from maybe looking at certain realities we experience, right? In other words, if you're living in a society where you have, right, one might say a totalitarian society, or where you have some very, very powerful leaders, if you make a mistake, that could be deadly. They could have your head. You could be thrown into jail. Not to mention the fact if you actually, right, rebelled against and did something intentionally against the one in power. And very powerful leaders don't tolerate mistakes. They don't deal with it well. And yet, what's the Torah telling us? Here is God who's in effect saying, you know what? Yes, you did something which is very serious. Yes, you made a mistake. But I want to give you the opportunity to correct it. I want to give you the opportunity to then come back into the relationship. And maybe that's also a very, very powerful statement. The ability to forgive, the ability to move forward. Because ultimately what we would like to do is to maximize life and to maximize relationships. And I'm sure everybody has had the experience that there may have been situations of people who hurt you, and sometimes unintentionally, and where it's very hard to then forgive them, even when they might actually be expressing their remorse and sincere. But because of the pain, how could I move forward? But maybe this is a lesson that you learn from the sacrifices of a God who's not interested in seeing that people die, but a God who ultimately wants to see people who live, of a God who ultimately wants to be able to find a mechanism by which we can forgive. But it also has the expectation that the people will seek that forgiveness and will acknowledge the fact that there's a need to correct the relationship, to fix it. Since I see my time is running out, so I want to just end with something that actually appears on my sheet, which is from Rashi, and say the following. I think that the sacrifices are also a very interesting illustration of the relationship between the written law and the oral law. And what do I mean by that? When we look at the written law, especially in this week's Parsha, it's very, very technical. It's very dry. I would use the word ritualistic. Okay, and that's why I think very many people find it hard to relate to it. The oral law, a big part of the oral law, is not only to flesh out the details of the written law, but ultimately the oral law, by doing that, is trying to give us a sense of the spirit of the law, of something deeper which is going on, beyond just the technicalities. And here what I would like to bring up with the Rashis on my sheet are what I would call the ethical dimension of the sacrifices. And I brought a few examples on my sheet from a few Rashis to illustrate this. So the first one is from chapter 1, verse 2, which is a pretty straightforward verse until you get to this drash. Okay, everybody have it? It says, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban lashem, which literally means, a man, if you bring a burnt offering to God. Okay, very straightforward. But in true rabbinic form, the rabbis are bothered by the usage of the word Adam. Why do you preface this by saying, a man if you bring? You could have just as easily said, if one brings, ki yakriv, because before that it says that Moshe now says to the Jewish people, if one brings, without using the word Adam. So the rabbis make a drash, exegetical comment, which says, why does it say Adam? Because it's hinting to the original Adam. And what it's saying is, when you bring a sacrifice, bring it like Adam would have done. And what does that mean? In the same way that Adam did not bring a sacrifice from stolen property, because at that point, anything that existed essentially belonged to him. So too, you don't bring from stolen property. Which means that according to this drash, the very first thing that we're told when we begin the laws of the sacrifices is that sacrifices cannot be used as a way of laundering money, of getting atonement, of being exonerated for all kinds of social ills. You can't steal and then bring that as a sacrifice and say, oh, but I'm bringing this as a sacrifice to God. That is not a mitzvah. That is not a way of coming close to God. That's a way of distancing God. That is what is seen as being revolting to God. Which means that the very first point which is being made here is that the ritual life of the Jewish people is predicated on an ethical life and should not be as I said, atonement for the lack of an ethical life. And I might even say that by reading the rituals carefully, you'll see how they're directing you to ethical practice. Let's look at a second example. When it talks about, this is from chapter 1, verse 16. This is talking about bird offerings. And at a certain point, it mentions that when you bring this bird offering, before you burn it on the altar, you slit it open, you take out its stomach, you throw it away, and then you burn it on the altar. So the rabbis say, why do we do that? And the answer is because birds have a tendency of moving around, of eating anywhere, essentially of eating something which is somebody's private property. Their whole sustenance is very often predicated on stealing. So their stomach, which is filled with what they've stolen, cannot be offered on the altar. By the way, I'll also mention, I told you that chapter 5, which is the end of our parsha, the very last sacrifice which it speaks about is where a person stole, compounded their sin by taking an oath that they didn't, and then subsequently admits. It's not coincidental that the last offering, and one might even say maybe the most guilty offering, is stealing. And by the way, you should just know that throughout rabbinic literature, they see stealing as being perhaps the most undermining element in a just society, in a holy society. This is what they see as characterizing stone. This is what they see as characterizing the generation of the flood. And therefore, what they're saying is, and this has no place in Jewish society. And I want to end with two other comments, which also I think are reflecting an ethical principle. In that same in verse 17, when it again is talking about a bird offering, it speaks about how you burn the whole bird together with the feathers. And Rashi is very bothered by it. He says, why would you want to burn the feathers? It just creates smoke and smell, and it's just not, again, aesthetically pleasing. So the answer which Rashi brings is that the Torah refers to this offering as being a pleasant odor to God. But how is it pleasant? So Rashi brings the comment which says, who generally brings a bird offering? Someone who doesn't have the means to bring something much nicer. And in fact, the whole way it starts is with bringing a bull, because presumably people who have the means will bring a big bull, right, which is very impressive and which really seems like a real present, so to speak, to God. But birds, big deal. Excuse me for saying it's for the birds. But in any case, but the point which Rashi makes is, by saying that you burn the whole thing, and even though when you burn it, right, objectively speaking, you would say that this doesn't have a pleasant fragrance. But in the text, it says it is a reach nichoach, a pleasant fragrance to God. And then Rashi brings the comment which says, whether one does a lot or whether one does a little, the important thing is that they devote their heart to God. Which means that ultimately God is not necessarily impressed by the magnitude, by the size of what you offer, but by the intent behind it. Think about this, right? People who make contributions to shuls, or people, right, who give charity. Which gift matters more? And what this is saying is, what matters is your heart. And why are you giving this? How do you give it? And this connects with the last thing. In the beginning of chapter 2, when it talks about the meal offering, it says nefesh, a soul. Ki yakriv korban mincha, when you offer a meal offering. So Rashi and the rabbis understood that a meal offering is offered by the most destitute person. They have nothing. What they only have is a little bit of flour and oil. But the way the Torah describes it is, if you offer this, and this is all that you have, God considers it as if you've given everything, your whole soul, to God. And so that the ethical principle which comes up over here is that everyone has what we could call equal access to God. And that it's not as if, right, it's only those people who have more means who are able to access God, but the people with lesser means, right, God doesn't give them the time of day. But in fact, God is actually open to everyone equally, where what matters to God is your heart. So that someone who offers the most minimal thing, but this is all that they have to give, will in effect be considered as having given God much more than the individual who gives to God something very significant, but couldn't care less about it. And as I said, I think this becomes a very important point when it comes to giving tzedakah. I remember many years ago, and I'll just end with this because I think it's something for people to think about. Many years ago, there was someone who was the director of Pardes, and at that time he was trying to raise funds for Pardes because this is when Pardes was really beginning its fundraising campaign. And he had a parlor meeting of a bunch of alumni who got together. And at this parlor meeting, there was one individual who got up and said at the time, he's giving $100. And then he looked at everybody in the room and he said the following. He said, for those people in the room who know me, you know that actually giving $100 is really a lot of money for me. But I'm doing that. Why? Because that's showing what Pardes meant to me. Because I really appreciate, and I'm prepared to really stretch myself to show my gratitude. And I would say that with that $100 gift by that person, I can say definitively, probably meant much more than a $50,000 gift, or maybe even more than that given by certain other people who could spend that on a weekend somewhere. And so it really raises a very serious question for us, that to what extent it is that we somehow look at gifts and we look at, in terms of objective terms, without necessarily looking at the kavanah behind it. And again, I come back and say, and this may be true also in our relationship with people. You give somebody a birthday gift, you give somebody a wedding gift, you give somebody any type of present. Is that going to be valued because of how much money it is? Or is that going to be valued because of the kavanah that was behind it? So what I've tried to show you is that there are many things that we can learn from the world of sacrifices, which if we really study them, we could then actually apply to our day-to-day lives. And this is why studying sacrifices and laws of purity and impurity become important for us, because we're not actually practicing these things. And some people might say we don't want to practice them whenever it will happen. But nevertheless, maybe there are many things we could learn which could have very significant meaning to our day-to-day lives and ultimately make us better people and help us create a more perfect society. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.